Hello, Jeff Sachs here, and welcome to Lecture 5 of the Marco Polo Drive of Peace, Culture, and Sustainable Development. We are in one of the most beautiful places in the entire world, one of the most beautiful squares anywhere in the world. We are in Registan Square in the heart of Samarkand, this ancient and historic city. We are in the heart of Central Asia. Let's recall our trip started in Rome, and from Rome we went to Venice, the home of the Polo family, the place of departure of Marco Polo and his father Niccolo and uncle Maffeo in 1271 as they headed east to arrive at the court of Kublai Khan, the Mongol emperor who was the ruler of all of the Mongol lands, but was the ruler of the Yuan dynasty with his capital in Han Balik, today's Beijing. We traveled east from Venice across the Balkan Peninsula. Remember that we visited Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia, and Bulgaria, crossing the Balkans Peninsula. From there, we went to Constantinople, to Istanbul, to one of the centers of world commerce, trade, and history, and the bridge of Europe and Asia. And crossing that bridge over the Bosphorus to go from Europe to Asia, for me, was very thrilling, because that's literally the bridge between these two continents, but actually all part of one giant continent, Eurasia. From Constantinople or Istanbul, we headed east. We went along the southern coast of the Black Sea or the northern coast of Anatolia and visited some of the famous Silk Route stops of the caravanserai in Samsun and Trabzon as we headed east to the end of the Black Sea region and to reach the Caucasus. Of course, we started in the Caucasus in Batumi, a coastal city on the Black Sea, on the eastern end of the Black Sea in today's state of Georgia, and then went to the capital, Tbilisi, and then from the capital headed east to Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, and then reached the Caspian Sea. So our trip continued trans-Caspian, crossing the Caspian Sea and reaching the city of Aktau, Kazakhstan, on the other side of the Caspian Sea, a relatively new oil town in the oil-rich Caspian region. And from Aktau, we continued east to Nukus, Nukus being a desert city of today's Uzbekistan, and by quirk of fate, home to one of the most glorious art museums in the world, which was collected by a very brilliant Russian artist and art collector, Igor Savitsky. And the Savitsky Museum was a treasure in the desert. And from Nukus, we continued east so that we began to reach the great historic sites of Uzbekistan, where we are today. We went to Khiva, the medieval town, almost completely preserved and still a living city, great oasis center on the Silk Routes. And I emphasize the Silk Routes because the caravans that came to Khiva, as well as to Bukhara and Samarkand, came both east and west, trading between the Far East, China, and as far west as Europe, and also north-south, trading from South Asia, from today's northern India, today's Pakistan, today's Afghanistan, into Central Asia. From Khiva, we went to Bukhara, another fabulous oasis city along the major river that we call the Amu Darya, but that the ancients called the Oxus River. And actually two rivers, one a tributary of the Oxus, the Zarafshan River, was another source of the fertility of this oasis region. So Bukhara bloomed. It bloomed not only in physical character as an oasis city, but it bloomed culturally, architecturally. We visited great artisanry shops and still manufacturers that sustain the ancient traditions of artisanry of the ancient Bukhara rug making, the ceramics, and the other wonderful artisanry, all still active and preserved centuries, indeed millennia. And from Bukhara, we arrived now in Samarkand. We are across the Oxus River from the point of view of the ancient Greeks and Romans, and so they called this region across the Oxus, or Transoxiana. And Transoxiana was the ancient name given to the region where we are right now. It's the name you would read in ancient and classic Latin sources and through the medieval period, across the Oxus River, the Oxus being today's Amu Darya. And Transoxiana extends to the next river, the Sir Darya. Both the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya flow to the northwest. They rise in Tajikistan and Afghanistan, and they flow to the north through this desert region to reach the Aral Sea. The ancient name for the Sir Darya is the Jakartas River, and so the area between the Oxus and the Jakartas is the Transoxiana region. So we are in Transoxiana, not only in Transoxiana, but in this spectacular square, which from all accounts of the archaeologists has been an active site for trade, for commerce, for exchange, for public events, including public executions, for reading the declarations of the kings and the emirs of this region, and, as we'll see, for classical study. Because indeed, as I stand in Registan Square, I am surrounded by three of the most beautiful places of learning, madrasas, places of Islamic learning that date back, in the case of the great Ulugh Beg Madrasa on my right over here, date back to 1417 to 1420. So we have recently celebrated the 600th anniversary of this remarkable madrasa. A couple centuries after this madrasa was constructed, this remarkable sheer door madrasa over on my left was constructed around the years 1610. By then, Samarkand was no longer the capital of an empire, but was a major city in the Bukhara Emirate. And behind me, the third of the madrasas, Tilya Kori Madrasa, which is dating from around 1640 AD. So we have this incredible assemblage of the three madrasas, and you can see the dome in the back. That is the Friday Mosque for Registan Square. Three madrasas and the Friday Mosque all assembled in this absolutely spectacular architecture. What impresses me, not only about the beauty of the architecture, but its history and its meaning, is the layers of civilization, the Persian aspects, the Arabic aspects, the Turkic aspects that make this architecture unique, but also reflect the fact that where we stand, and indeed for all of Transoxiana Oxiana, we are speaking of layers and layers and layers of history going back 2,500 years and more. It's just worth recalling how the great empires all came here, conquered, retreated, were conquered in turn, and layer upon layer of empire battled for this precious oasis space on the Zarafshan River, the tributary to the Oxus River. And all during this time, these were cosmopolitan places. These were places where people were coming from China, places where people were coming from Arabia, places where people were coming from the nomadic Turkic north, places where people were coming from the southwest, today's Iran, or the great Persian region. And so we have all the layers of civilization so magnificently joined together in this unique square and in this unique beauty of the architecture. Well, if we go back as far as we can reliably, this region 2,000 years ago, 2,700 years ago, with some archaeological sites very nearby demonstrating this, was already a settlement. It was already a trading region, and it was a trading region of a people called the Sogdiana. And the Sogdiana spoke a language, Sogdian, which is a Eastern Persian dialect. So they were essentially part of the Persian linguistic and cultural space. By the 5th century BC, 6th century BC, this had become part of the great Achaemenid Persian Empire, the empire of Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great, who plays so much role in European history. He's the one that released the Jewish exiles who had been taken into exile by Babylonia, and then when Cyrus conquered Babylon, he released the Jews to return and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Cyrus, known to us as Cyrus the Great because he led a great and astounding flowering of civilization, of politics, of the arts, and he also ruled as far east as here. This was part of the Achaemenid Empire on its eastern expanses. Well, equally remarkably, recall that the Achaemenid Empire was succeeded, conquered, by none other than Alexander the Great. I think of Alexander the Great first as Aristotle's student. You could say his star student, except that he didn't follow all of the ethical precepts of Aristotle, but he did conquer much of the world. He aimed to conquer all of the world. He arrived in Transoxiana around 320 BC, 328 BC. He found the fight against Sogdiana a very, very difficult fight. They resisted for several years. Actually, the fighting between the Macedonians, led by Alexander the Great, and the Sogdians ended only, not through the battlefield, but a much nicer way, by betrothal. Alexander took his bride, Roxanne, the shining star is the meaning in Sogdian language. He took Roxanne as his bride, and the Sogdian nobles pledged their loyalty to Alexander. Of course, Alexander was to die very young, at the age 32, just a few years later, after he and his troops had returned westward to Babylon. Alexandrian empires continued for centuries. Recall that upon Alexander's death, his generals battled for succession. One general, the general of this region, established an empire named after him, the Seleucid Empire. Seleucus conquered this region and ruled over this region as a Greek region. I was actually quite touched when we stepped into our vehicle in Bukhara, and the driver introduced himself, and I said, "What's your name?" And he said, "Alex." And I said, "Oh, that's interesting. what's your full name? And he said, Iskander, which of course is the ancient name for Alexander. So this is a name that has been in circulation since Alexander arrived here 23 centuries ago. Well, the Seleucids ruled here for a couple of centuries. The Seleucid Empire was followed by the Greco-Bactrian Empire, whose capital was in modern-day Afghanistan in Balkh, but was known then as the land of Bactria. This was the long Greek phase, and it left its mark not only in the names of our drivers, but in many other cultural and architectural sites. After the Persian and the Greek period came a North Indian period. Absolutely fascinating. A great empire that extended over northern India, today's Pakistan, today's Afghanistan, and into Transoxiana. And that was the Kushan Empire. And what was distinctive about the highly successful, highly cultured Kushan Empire was that it brought Buddhism to this region. And indeed, Buddhism extended both west and east along the Silk routes, which were already operating for hundreds of years. The Sogdian peoples were merchants. They were traders along the ancient Silk route. The Silk route existed from the time of the Achaemenid Empire and Alexander and through the Kushan period. And the Kushan period lasted for several centuries. After that came some rule by invaders from the north, from nomadic Turkic peoples, peoples who would become the ancestors of today's Turkic Uzbek population. So the Turkic Khaganate was one of these empires around 500 to 600 AD. It was soon followed by yet another civilizational invasion, because it was in the 7th century, in the 600s, that the Arabs reached this region. They crossed the Oxus, and the Umayyad Empire took rule here, bringing Islam to this region, because the Persian people were Zoroastrian, but now Islam would step by step make its dominance into this region with the arrival of the Arab peoples. And the Arab peoples ruled here for hundreds of years. There was then another Persian great period of Persian rule, and then after that period of Persian rule, more rule by nomadic conquerors, and then the great and decisive event for Eurasia occurred, and that is when Genghis Khan, or Genghis Khan, as we know very well, the founder of the great Mongol Empire, arrived and conquered this region. So Samarkand and indeed Transoxiana became part of the great Mongol Empire, which soon enough by the 1260s and 1270s extended from the Pacific Ocean all the way to the Black Sea and all the way into today's Middle East. It was finally stopped in its westward advances by the Mamluk rulers of Egypt in a great battle in the eastern Mediterranean region. Well, the Mongols ruled here for roughly a century, and the Mongol Empire itself divided into 4 components after the death of Kublai Khan in 1294, and this place became part of the Chingate Khanate, and it remained under the Chingate Khanate into the 14th century. At that point, as the Mongol Khanates were being pushed back and reduced in all 4 of the regions, in China, in the Central Asia, in the Ilkhanate of today's Iran, in the Golden Horde of today's Russia and Ukraine, as the Mongol hold was being undone step by step. A very bold, very tough, very ruthless, and very successful Turkic conqueror arose in this region. His name was Timur. We know him in the West as Tamerlane sometimes, Timur the Lame, because he walked with a limp as the result of a war injury, or so it is said. But Timur recreated as a Turkic ruler, but claiming the legitimacy and inheritance of the Mongol Empire, recreated much of the Western Mongol Empire, parts of today's Russia, parts of today's Iran, parts of today's Central Asia, including where we are today, became part of the Timurid Empire. The Timurid Empire at its peak never recovered all of the lands of the Mongols, though Timur hoped to do so. China never reverted to rule by the Turkic or Mongol rulers, though they did eventually fall to another semi-nomadic group, the Manchus, in the 17th century. But Timur did succeed in creating a vast contiguous empire of around 4.5 million square kilometers. And its headquarters was right here in Samarkand. And this was the central square of the Timurid Empire. His descendants continued to rule, and his grandson is one of my favorite people. His grandson was the mayor of Samarkand. He later became briefly the leader of the whole Timurid Empire, but he was for a long time the mayor of Samarkand, and his name is Ulugh Beg. And Ulugh Beg gave the name to this wonderful madrasa that, as I said, celebrated recently its 600th anniversary. Now, why do I admire Ulugh Beg so much? Because he was a great scientist, one of the great astronomers of the medieval period, one of the greatest learned men, and one of the greatest champions of learning and of culture. So this madrasa was a research center, not only for religious learning, as we sometimes associate madrasas, but for the study of astronomy, for the study of the natural world. If you look up, you see these magnificent stars in this beautiful tile work. And these stars are said to reflect the fact that Ulugh Beg was the great astronomer of his age. Nearby here is Ulugh Beg's magnificent observatory. It was actually not even known for hundreds of years. It had to be excavated and rediscovered, the greatness of Ulugh Beg's work. But one can say that in the early 1400s, he had observed with precision the location of more stars, and he had observed with precision the timing of the celestial, of the Earth's orbit around the sun, and calculated more closely than the European astronomers had done at that point the period of the Earth's orbit around the sun. And his works did travel. They were made known in the West, and we have documented copies of his celestial observations in the Oxford Library in editions from the 17th century. So Ulugh Beg was a great administrator, a great teacher, a great promoter of science, and one of the greatest scientists of the medieval period himself. And I'm thrilled that the government will celebrate his legacy by establishing an Ulugh Beg Sustainable Development Research Institute in Samarkand. Sustainable, our theme. and so much needed in this region, and it will carry the name of one of the greatest scientists of history. Well, we have briefly covered 2,500 years of history, but let's talk about the present as well, because Central Asia is, on the one hand, now part of the great and dynamic and growing middle corridor that we are traveling from Rome to Hong Kong, and this is going to be a 21st century Silk Route of the same kind of dynamism of trade, of commerce, of tourism, and of exchange of ideas as in the past. So I'm very thrilled about the fact that Uzbekistan is so dynamic economically now, and this middle corridor is taking a new shape, especially with the impetus given by China's Belt and Road Initiative, which understands centrally that connectivity is key for prosperity and key for sustainable development. Yet this region is also deeply challenged in sustainable development because this is a region that is beset with environmental challenges. Remember the two great river systems, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, that is the Oxus River, and the Jakartes River, as was known in ancient times. Both have dramatically reduced water flows, in part because of the massive and over diversion of these rivers for irrigation of this desert region. One of the ideas of the Soviet period was to make the desert bloom by irrigation from the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya rivers. But it was not thought out properly. It was not a sustainable proposition. And the result was that the river flow could not support the massive irrigation, and catastrophes have resulted, most dramatically, of course, in the shocking decline and almost disappearance of the Aral Sea, which has disappeared so much that it's now divided into two inland parts. One is partially replenishing, the other seems to still be on its way out. What I'm thrilled about is that Uzbekistan and its other Central Asian partners, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan increasingly, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, the 5 countries of Central Asia, are paying attention to the sustainable development challenges, to the water challenges, to the protection of biodiversity, to the protection of the Caspian Sea, and they are undertaking a massive transformation of the energy system as well. One thing I can tell you as we drive across Central Asia, there's plenty of sunshine. We are not even in steppe or grassland region here. We're in desert region, of course, with the bloom of oases because of the river systems. But we are in desert regions, which means plenty of sunshine. And I'm happy to tell you that on our way to Samarkand today, on our way to Registan Square, we visited a massive solar plant that has a capacity of 220 megawatts of solar installation, and this is a massive project undertaken by Uzbekistan in partnership with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, with the European Investment Bank, with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and with the Asian Development Bank. So it's a wonderful program of multilateralism and sustainable development, and a demonstration of the commitment of Central Asia to make the transformations to protect this beautiful environment, this magnificent and unique history, and to play a role in helping to protect the overall Earth's physical systems. So please enjoy this beauty. I always savor being here, and it's an absolute special treat to be here in Registan Square together with you.